In the blood-soaked annals of the Lincoln County War, there rode a man whose name has been overshadowed by his more famous companion, yet whose deadly skills with a pistol were equally feared throughout the New Mexico Territory. Jose Chavez y Chavez was not merely a sidekick to Billy the Kid. He was a cold-blooded killer in his own right, a man who transformed from a peaceful ranch hand into one of the most dangerous regulators to ever ride the dusty trails of the Southwest. His story is one of vengeance, friendship, and redemption, a tale that reveals the complex cultural tensions that fueled some of the deadliest conflicts in Old West history. Remember to hit the like button, because it helps us a lot. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the notification bell to not miss the upcoming interesting videos. Early life and heritage. The rugged mountains and sun-baked valleys of the New Mexico Territory in the mid-1800s were home to a diverse population that included Hispanic settlers whose families had lived on the land for generations, Native American tribes who had called the region home for centuries, and Anglo-American newcomers who arrived with dreams of wealth and opportunity. These three groups existed in an uneasy coexistence, their cultures clashing and blending in equal measure across the vast frontier. It was into this volatile cultural landscape that Jose Chavez y Chavez was born around 1851 in the small community of Rio Arriba County, a region known for its traditional Hispanic villages and ancient land grants. Jose's heritage was a blend of the peoples who had shaped the Southwest. His family traced their lineage to both Spanish colonial settlers and the Navajo people, giving him connections to two distinct cultural traditions that valued honor, loyalty, and the willingness to fight for one's beliefs. This mixed ancestry was not uncommon in New Mexico, where intermarriage between Hispanic settlers and native peoples had occurred for generations. The Chavez family were not wealthy landowners, but neither were they destitute. They worked the land, raised livestock, and tried to carve out a modest existence in a territory that was rapidly changing around them. Like many Hispanic families, they held tightly to their traditions, their Catholic faith, and their sense of community, even as outside forces threatened their way of life. Growing up, Jose learned the skills that every young man in the territory needed to survive. He became an expert horseman capable of spending long days in the saddle herding cattle across the vast open ranges that stretched to the horizon. He learned to shoot with the accuracy that the harsh frontier demanded, where a missed shot could mean the difference between eating and going hungry, or between life and death when facing hostile threats, whether from wild animals or dangerous men. The young Jose also absorbed the values of his community, the importance of family, the obligations of friendship, and the necessity of defending one's honor when challenged. These values would shape his actions throughout his life, for better and for worse. The New Mexico Territory of Jose's youth was a place of simmering tensions. Hispanic families who had held land grants from the Spanish and Mexican governments found their claims increasingly challenged by Anglo newcomers, who often had the backing of territorial courts and politicians. Disputes over water rights, grazing land, and property boundaries grew more frequent and more violent. This conflict over land and resources would eventually explode into open warfare, and Jose Chavez y Chavez would find himself at the very center of the violence. By the time Jose reached his mid-20s, he had established himself as a capable ranch hand, and vaquero respected for his work ethic and his skills. He found work on various ranches throughout Lincoln County, a vast expanse of territory in southeastern New Mexico that would soon become infamous as the site of one of the bloodiest conflicts in frontier history. It was here that Jose's life would take a dramatic turn, leading him down a path from honest labor to outlawry and violence. The Lincoln County War erupts. To understand how Jose Chavez y Chavez transformed from a working cowhand into a cold-blooded regulator, one must first understand the powder keg that was Lincoln County in the late 1870s. This was not simply a conflict between lawmen and outlaws, but rather an economic war between two powerful factions fighting for control of the lucrative government contracts that supplied beef and goods to nearby Fort Stanton and the Mescalero Apache Reservation. On one side stood Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan Irish immigrants who had established a virtual monopoly over the region's commerce through their mercantile business known simply as the House. Murphy and Dolan controlled not only the general store, but also the beef contracts, the banking, and seemingly every aspect of economic life in Lincoln County. They had powerful allies, including members of the notorious Santa Fe Ring, a group of corrupt politicians and businessmen who dominated territorial affairs. Those who challenged Murphy and Dolan's dominance often found themselves facing trumped-up legal charges, violent intimidation, or worse. Into this volatile situation came John Henry Tunstall, a young Englishman with dreams of building his own commercial empire. Tunstall arrived in Lincoln County in 1876 and quickly established a ranch and store in direct competition with the House. Unlike Murphy and Dolan, who were known for charging exorbitant prices and keeping settlers in perpetual debt, Tunstall offered fair deals and honest treatment. He attracted a loyal group of employees and allies, including a young drifter named William Bonney, who would soon become known to history as Billy the Kid. Jose Chavez y Chavez was among those who found employment with Tunstall and came to admire the Englishman's integrity and fair treatment. For Hispanic workers like Jose, who often faced discrimination from Anglo employers, Tunstall represented something different, a man who judged others by their character and abilities rather than their ethnicity. This loyalty would prove unshakable even after Tunstall's death and would drive Jose to commit acts of deadly vengeance. The tensions between the two factions escalated throughout 1877, with each side maneuvering for advantage. Murphy and Dolan used their influence with corrupt officials to harass Tunstall with questionable legal proceedings. Tunstall and his ally, Alexander McSween, a lawyer who had broken with the House, responded by challenging the monopoly in court and in the marketplace. On February 18, 1878, the conflict turned deadly. A posse organized by Sheriff William Brady, who was firmly in the pocket of Murphy and Dolan, rode out to Tunstall's ranch, ostensibly to attach property in connection with a legal dispute. When they encountered Tunstall on the trail returning from his ranch, they shot him down in cold blood. The Englishman was unarmed and made no attempt to resist. After killing him, members of the posse shot his horse, placed Tunstall's hat beneath its head and his pistol by his side, creating the false impression that he had gone down fighting. When news of Tunstall's murder reached his employees, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Billy the Kid, who had developed an almost filial attachment to the young Englishman, swore vengeance. Jose Chavez y Chavez, equally devoted to Tunstall, felt the same burning desire for retribution. The Lincoln County War had begun in earnest, and Jose would prove himself one of its deadliest participants, joining the Regulators. In the immediate aftermath of John Tunstall's murder, his supporters were consumed by grief and rage. The men who had worked for the Englishman and admired his fairness were not content to let his killers escape justice through a legal system they knew to be hopelessly corrupt. Within days of the murder, a group of Tunstall's former employees organized themselves into a vigilante force that would become known as the Regulators. The formation of the Regulators had a thin veneer of legality, justice of the peace. John Wilson, who was sympathetic to the Tunstall faction, issued warrants for the arrest of those believed responsible for the murder. He appointed Dick Brewer, Tunstall's ranch foreman, as a special constable with the authority to serve these warrants. Brewer quickly assembled a group of men willing to ride with him, including Billy the Kid, Charlie Boder, Doc Skurlock, and Jose Chavez y Chavez. For Jose, the decision to join the Regulators was not difficult. Tunstall had treated him with respect at a time when many Anglo employers viewed Hispanic workers as inferior. The Englishman had been murdered in cold blood by men who Jose knew would never face justice through normal legal channels. The code of honor that Jose had absorbed from his Hispanic and Navajo heritage demanded that such a wrong be avenged. He would ride with the Regulators, and he would make Tunstall's killers pay with their lives. The Regulators were a diverse group, united by their loyalty to Tunstall and their hatred of the Murphy-Dolan faction. Billy the Kid quickly emerged as one of the group's most prominent members, his quick wit and quicker gun making him a natural leader, even though Dick Brewer technically held command. Jose Chavez y Chavez became one of Billy's closest companions, the two men forming a bond forged in shared danger and common purpose. Among the regulators, Jose stood out for his deadly calm under fire and his unerring accuracy with a pistol. While some men grew nervous or reckless in gunfights, Jose maintained an icy composure that made him all the more dangerous. He was not a braggart or a showman, like some frontier gunfighters, but rather a quiet, methodical killer who did what he believed needed to be done without hesitation or remorse. The regulators wasted no time in beginning their campaign of vengeance. On March 6, 1878, less than 3 weeks after Tunstall's murder, they caught up with two members of the posse that had killed him. William Morton and Frank Baker were captured by the regulators after a chase of several miles. What happened next remains disputed, but the outcome is clear. Morton and Baker, along with regulator William McCloskey, who was suspected of being a traitor, were all killed. The Murphy-Dolan faction claimed the prisoners had been murdered in cold blood, while the regulators insisted they had been shot while trying to escape. Jose Chavez y Chavez was present and likely participated in the killings, marking his first blood as a regulator. The deaths of Morton, Baker, and McCloskey sent a clear message to the Murphy-Dolan faction. The regulators were not interested in legal niceties or courtroom justice. They intended to hunt down every man involved in Tunstall's murder and execute them. The war had escalated to a new and deadlier level, and Jose Chavez y Chavez had proven himself willing and able to kill. Blood and bullets, the killing spree. With the deaths of Morton and Baker, the Lincoln County War entered its bloodiest phase. The regulators operated as a roving band of avengers, striking at their enemies with swift and merciless violence. Jose Chavez y Chavez rode at the forefront of this campaign, his skill with a pistol and his unwavering loyalty to his companions, making him one of the most effective and feared members of the group. On April 1, 1878, the regulators carried out their most audacious strike yet. Sheriff William Brady, the corrupt lawman who had organized the posse that killed Tunstall, walked down the main street of Lincoln accompanied by 4 deputies. The regulators had positioned themselves behind an adobe wall waiting in ambush. As Brady and his men passed, the hidden gunmen opened fire. Sheriff Brady fell dead in the street, hit by multiple bullets. Deputy George Heineman was also mortally wounded, dying within minutes. Jose Chavez y Chavez was one of the men behind that adobe wall, though the exact shots he fired in the fusillade cannot be determined with certainty. What is clear is that he was a willing participant in the killing of a sheriff, an act that transformed the regulators from vigilantes with a questionable legal sanction into outright outlaws. There would be no turning back now. The Murphy-Dolan faction responded to Brady's killing by organizing their own group of fighters. Led by men like Jesse Evans and members of a gang known as the Boys, these gunmen began their own campaign of violence against the regulators and their supporters. Lincoln County descended into a state of near anarchy, with both sides ambushing, killing, and terrorizing anyone suspected of sympathizing with the enemy. 3 days after Sheriff Brady's assassination, the regulators struck again. They surrounded the camp of Buckshot Roberts, a member of the posse that had killed Tunstall at Blazer's Mills. Roberts was a former soldier and buffalo hunter who, despite his age and a crippled arm, was a formidable fighter. He refused to surrender, and a fierce gunfight erupted. When the smoke cleared, Buckshot Roberts lay dying from a stomach wound, but he had taken Dick Brewer with him, shooting the regulator leader through the eye. Charlie Boder was also wounded in the fight. The death of Dick Brewer was a severe blow to the regulators, but it did not end their campaign. Leadership of the group passed informally to Billy the Kid, with Jose Chavez y Chavez remaining as one of his most trusted lieutenants. The fighting continued throughout the spring of 1878, with both sides suffering casualties. Jose participated in numerous skirmishes and gunfights during this period, his reputation as a deadly shot growing with each encounter. The cultural dimension of the conflict was never far from the surface. Many of the regulators were Hispanic like Jose, and they saw the Murphy-Dolan faction as representatives of Anglo domination and corruption. For Jose, the fight was not just about avenging Tunstall, but also about resisting a system that had marginalized and exploited his people for years. This gave him an additional motivation to fight, and perhaps helps explain his willingness to kill without apparent remorse. By midsummer of 1878, the regulators had killed numerous enemies, but they had also lost several of their own number. The territorial governor had issued proclamations against both sides, but these had little effect on the ground. The war was building toward a climactic confrontation that would determine the fate of Lincoln County and of Jose Chavez y Chavez himself. The 5-day battle. In mid-July of 1878, the simmering conflict in Lincoln County exploded into open warfare in the streets of the town of Lincoln itself. What became known as the 5-day battle, or the Battle of Lincoln, would prove to be the climax of the entire war, and Jose Chavez y Chavez would find himself trapped in a burning building fighting for his life, alongside Billy the Kid. The confrontation began on July 15th, when a group of regulators including Billy the Kid, Jose Chavez y Chavez, and approximately 40 other men rode into Lincoln and took up positions in several buildings, including the large adobe home of Alexander McSween. McSween himself was present, though. As a man opposed to violence, he did not carry a weapon. His wife, Susan, was also in the house throughout much of the battle. The Murphy-Dolan faction quickly responded, marshaling their own forces, including a group of men known as the Rio Grande Posse, who had been deputized by the territorial sheriff. Within hours, Lincoln had become a battlefield with fighters on both sides, occupying buildings and exchanging gunfire across the town's single main street. For 5 days, the two sides blazed away at each other. The regulators held several buildings, including the McSween House, the Montano Store, and the Ellis House. Their enemies occupied the Wortley Hotel, the Torian, an old defensive tower, and other positions. Bullets flew constantly, shattering windows, splintering wood, and occasionally finding human targets. Several men on both sides were wounded during the prolonged exchange. Jose Chavez y Chavez was in the McSween house throughout the battle. Armed with his pistol and rifle, he took his place at the windows, firing at any enemy who showed himself. The situation inside the house was tense and uncomfortable, with dozens of armed men crowded together, waiting for an attack that could come at any moment. Susan McSween tried to maintain morale, even playing the piano at one point, a surreal touch amidst the violence. On the 5th day, July 19th, the Murphy-Dolan faction made their decisive move. Colonel Nathan Dudley, the commander of Fort Stanton, arrived in Lincoln with soldiers and artillery. Although Dudley claimed neutrality, his actions made clear which side he favored. He positioned his howitzer and Gatling gun to threaten the regulator positions, and his presence emboldened the Murphy-Dolan fighters. That evening, as darkness fell, the Murphy-Dolan men set fire to the McSween house. The flames spread slowly, giving those inside time to consider their limited options. They could remain and burn to death, they could surrender and likely be killed, or they could attempt to fight their way out through the cordon of enemies surrounding the house. As the fire consumed room after room, the regulators retreated through the house ahead of the flames. Finally, with the building fully engulfed, they made their break. Billy the Kid led the way, bursting out of the back door with his pistol blazing. Jose Chavez y Chavez was right behind him, firing at the muzzle flashes that erupted from the darkness. The escape was chaotic and bloody. Alexander McSween, who had refused to arm himself, was shot down in his own backyard. Several other regulators were killed in the desperate flight, but Billy the Kid made it through the cordon, and so did Jose Chavez y Chavez. Using the darkness and confusion as cover, they fled Lincoln and disappeared into the countryside. The 5-day battle was a military defeat for the regulators. Alexander McSween was dead, several of their fighters had been killed, and their organization was shattered. But Billy the Kid and Jose Chavez y Chavez had survived, and they were not yet finished with their enemies. Life as an outlaw. The end of the 5-day battle effectively concluded the Lincoln County War as an organized conflict. In the following months, the territorial governor Lew Wallace issued amnesty proclamations and attempted to restore order. Some former regulators accepted the amnesty and tried to return to peaceful lives. But for Billy the Kid and his closest companions, including Jose Chavez y Chavez, there would be no return to normalcy. They had become outlaws, and they would live as outlaws. In the months following the Battle of Lincoln, Billy the Kid gathered around him a small group of men who would become known as the rustlers. Jose Chavez y Chavez was a core member of this group, along with Tom O'Folliard, Charlie Boder, and others. They survived by stealing cattle from the ranges around Lincoln County and selling them to buyers who asked no questions about the brands. Cattle rustling was a common crime in the Old West, and in the chaotic conditions that followed the Lincoln County War, it flourished. Large ranchers like John Chisholm, who had supported the Tunstall-McSween faction during the war, now found their herds being raided by the very men who had fought on their side. Billy the Kid felt that Chisholm owed him money for his services as a regulator, and he was not shy about taking payment in the form of stolen beef. Jose Chavez y Chavez proved as adept at rustling as he had been at gunfighting. His skills as a horseman and his knowledge of the countryside made him valuable for locating cattle, driving them to hidden pastures, and evading pursuit. He and his companions lived a precarious existence, constantly moving to stay ahead of the law and the ranchers whose stock they stole. The life of a rustler was not without its dangers beyond the obvious legal risks. Jose and his companions had made many enemies during the Lincoln County War, and some of those enemies were determined to see them dead. There were several close calls during this period, as posses and bounty hunters attempted to capture or kill the outlaws. Despite the dangers, Jose remained loyal to Billy the Kid. The bond forged during the desperate days of the Lincoln County War held firm, even as their circumstances grew increasingly precarious. They were comrades in arms, and neither would abandon the other. This loyalty would ultimately prove costly for Jose, but it also reflected the code of honor that he had carried with him from his upbringing. Governor Lew Wallace attempted to bring Billy the Kid in through negotiation at one point, offering him a pardon in exchange for testimony against other participants in the war. Billy actually met with the governor and even gave testimony, but the promised pardon never materialized. Feeling betrayed, Billy returned to his outlaw ways, and Jose Chavez y Chavez rode with him, capture and imprisonment. By 1880, the authorities in New Mexico Territory were determined to put an end to Billy the Kid and his gang of rustlers. A new sheriff had been elected in Lincoln County, a man named Pat Garrett, who had actually known Billy socially in earlier days. Garrett was tasked with hunting down his former acquaintance, and he pursued this mission with relentless determination. In December of 1880, Garrett and his posse tracked Billy the Kid and several companions to a stone house at Stinking Springs near Fort Sumner. After a tense standoff in which Charlie Boder was killed, Billy the Kid and the others, including Tom Pickett and Billy Wilson, surrendered. Jose Chavez y Chavez was not present at Stinking Springs, having apparently separated from the group sometime earlier. Jose's luck ran out not long after. He was captured by lawmen and found himself facing serious charges related to his activities during the Lincoln County War and afterward. The territorial justice system that had been so corrupt during the war years was now functioning more effectively, and Jose would have to answer for his crimes. Jose Chavez y Chavez was tried and convicted on charges related to his participation in the murder of Sheriff William Brady during the April 1878 ambush in Lincoln. He was sentenced to be hanged for his role in the killing. For a time, it appeared that Jose would meet his end at the end of a rope like many other frontier outlaws. However, Jose's sentence was later commuted, and he was instead sent to prison to serve a lengthy term. The reasons for this commutation are not entirely clear, but it may have reflected lingering sympathy for the Tunstall-McSween faction, or doubts about which of the many men behind that adobe wall had actually fired the fatal shots. Whatever the reason, Jose had escaped the gallows, though he faced long years behind bars. Billy the Kid was not so fortunate. After being captured at Stinking Springs, he was tried and convicted for the murder of Sheriff Brady and sentenced to hang. In April 1881, he made a dramatic escape from the Lincoln County Courthouse, killing 2 deputies in the process. His freedom was short-lived. On July 14, 1881, Pat Garrett tracked Billy to a house in Fort Sumner and shot him dead in a darkened bedroom. Jose's closest companion during his outlaw years was gone. Jose served his time in the Territorial Penitentiary. Prison life in the Old West was harsh, with hard labor, poor food, and brutal discipline. But Jose endured, determined to survive and eventually gain his freedom. He had faced death many times during the Lincoln County War and its aftermath, and he would not be broken by imprisonment. Freedom, and later years after serving his sentence, Jose Chavez y Chavez was released from prison and stepped out into a New Mexico territory that had changed significantly during his years of incarceration. The old conflicts of the Lincoln County War era had faded into memory, and the territory was slowly becoming more settled and civilized. The railroad had arrived, bringing with it new towns, new businesses, and new people who knew nothing of the bloody feuds that had once torn the region apart. The age of the gunfighter and the outlaw was drawing to a close, replaced by an era of law and order that had little patience for men who had lived by the gun. Jose attempted to put his violent past behind him and live as a law-abiding citizen. He returned to the kind of work he had known before the war, laboring on ranches and trying to stay out of trouble. The skills he had learned as a young man, riding horses, herding cattle, and working the land, were still valuable, even in this changing world. For a man with his reputation, however, finding steady work was not always easy. Some people remembered him as a killer, one of the regulators, who had gunned down Sheriff Brady in the streets of Lincoln, and they wanted nothing to do with him. Others were curious about the man who had ridden with Billy the Kid and peppered him with questions about those violent days. Jose had to navigate carefully between those who feared him and those who romanticized him. The later years of Jose's life are not as well documented as his years as a regulator and outlaw. He lived quietly, working when he could, and avoiding the kind of trouble that had defined his younger days. Some accounts suggest that he married and tried to establish a stable family life, putting down roots in the communities of northern New Mexico, where he had been born, though details are scarce. He watched as the territory became a state in 1912, and as the Old West he had known faded into legend. Jose Chavez y Chavez died around 1924 in New Mexico, the land where he had been born and where he had lived his entire turbulent life. He was approximately 73 years old, having survived far longer than anyone might have predicted for a man who had lived so dangerously. Unlike many of his former companions who had died violently in gunfights or at the end of a rope, Jose passed away from natural causes. In the end, he had outlived nearly all of the major figures from the Lincoln County War, a final testament to his resilience and perhaps to his determination to leave his outlaw days behind. Legacy and conclusion. Jose Chavez y Chavez remains a fascinating yet often overlooked figure from the Old West. While Billy the Kid has become a legendary figure, the subject of countless books and films, his loyal companion Jose is frequently reduced to a minor supporting character or omitted entirely. This is unfortunate because Jose's story reveals important dimensions of the Lincoln County War and the frontier experience that are often ignored. As a man of Hispanic and Native American heritage, Jose represented the many people of color who participated in the conflicts and events of the Old West, but whose stories have been marginalized in popular memory. His loyalty to John Tunstall and later to Billy the Kid was rooted in the respect they showed him at a time when such respect was far from guaranteed. His willingness to kill in their cause reflected both the violent code of the frontier and his own sense of honor and justice. Jose Chavez y Chavez was a cold-blooded killer who participated in murders and robberies. He was also a man who stood by his friends and fought against those he saw as corrupt oppressors. Like so many figures from the Old West, he cannot be easily categorized as hero or villain. He was a complex man living in a violent time, and his story deserves to be remembered. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of the Old West's most intriguing yet forgotten outlaws, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from the frontier. Hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next video delving into the legends and realities of America's Wild West. The history of the frontier is filled with remarkable characters like Jose Chavez y Chavez, men and women, whose lives were shaped by loyalty, violence, and the relentless struggle for survival in an untamed land.